You may remember at the very end of the coronation in May of 2023 that the King and the Queen disappeared through a door right beside the high altar of Westminster Abbey. This door leads to one of the most sacred spaces within the Abbey, and we didn't see it on our television screens. It is the chapel of St Edward the Confessor, and it contains the shrine of St Edward, which, as I will explain, is really the spiritual heart and the focal point of the whole Abbey. Here, before the shrine, as all his forebears have done since the coronation of King Edward I in 1274, Charles III took off St Edward's crown, or in his case its 17th century iteration, and then put on the imperial state crown, ready for the departure procession. In this video, and in the next one, I will take you through that door and explore what's inside the chapel of St Edward the Confessor, looking at both the shrine and the royal tombs within it. I will also tell you why the king changes crowns. St Edward the Confessor was the second to last Anglo-Saxon king and the last reigning king of the House of Wessex. In 1042, when he succeeded his half-brother Harthcnut as king, there was already a monastery of Benedictine monks on the site of the present Westminster Abbey. It had been established in the 960s on an island called Thorney, at a point where the River Tyburn flows into the Thames, by Edward's grandfather, King Edgar. Almost immediately after his accession, Edward established a new London palace on the island just on the Thames foreshore. It is now the site of the Palace of Westminster. Edward also began to build on a much grander scale a new abbey church to replace the one his grandfather had constructed. It was completed in 1065, and it was Edward's intention to be buried in it, in preference to Winchester, which was the traditional burial place of Anglo-Saxon kings. King Edward died on the 5th of January 1066 and was buried on the very next day, the Feast of the Epiphany, in a tomb directly in front of the Abbey's high altar. He most probably prepared this grave well in advance of his death. During his lifetime, King Edward had a reputation for piety, but the cult of him as a saint only began to emerge 70 or so years after his death, in the 1130s. Miracles were alleged to have taken place at his tomb, and in 1138 Osbert de Clare, the prior of Westminster Abbey, began a campaign for the king's canonization. A narrative life of Edward had been commissioned by the king's widow, Queen Edith, shortly after his death, but in the 1130s Osbert rewrote this so that it read like a hagiography, a holy story, a saint's life. As well as performing miracles, it was claimed by Osbert that Edward's bodily remains had the odour of sanctity, which was a sure sign of his saintliness. Osbert recollects that in 1102, when the coffin lid of the king's tomb was lifted, a wonderful fragrance then filled the entirety of the church. At that opening, Edward's body was found to be wrapped in a pall of precious fabric, and he had a sceptre lying beside him, a ring on his finger, and importantly, a crown on his head. Fast forward now to 1159, and there was a disputed papal election in Rome, with the cardinals of the Holy Roman Church divided on who they should elect as pope, with the papal conclave electing two rival popes, Alexander III and Victor IV. The secular rulers of Europe were asked to break this stalemate by ratifying one or other of the candidates, and Henry II, the King of England, indicated that he would support Alexander III, who would eventually win. Now, such issues always provide opportunities, and the Abbot of Westminster at this time, Abbot Lawrence of Durham, used the good relations between King Henry II and the new Pope to push for King Edward to be declared a saint. And in February of 1161, Pope Alexander III therefore canonised Edward as St Edward the Confessor. A confessor is a saint who is not a martyr, but confesses their Christian faith through an exemplary and courageously lived life, sometimes in the face of hostility and opposition and great personal cost. Following Edward's canonization, preparations were made for the removal of his bodily remains, his saintly relics, to a much finer tomb or shrine. This new shrine was completed in the middle of 1163, and on the 13th of October that year, in the presence of King Henry II, the relics of St Edward were translated to it. We have some indication of what the 1163 shrine looked like, thanks to drawings in the only surviving manuscript copy of the life of St Edward. It is a manuscript of the 1250s or 60s and is kept in the Cambridge University Library. It appears that the shrine had a base in which were cut holes into which pilgrims might crawl to get closer to Edward's holy relics. The relics themselves were on top of this base in an enriched coffin called a ferretry, which had a gable-ended roof. And the end of the ferretry appears to have been decorated with figurative work, perhaps in enamel, including a figure of Christ in Majesty, of St Edward himself, and of various bishops. On either side of the shrine are shown figures of St Edward and a beggar, a depiction of the saint's most popular miracle recorded by Osbert in his life. The legend recounts that St Edward was out riding one day when he was approached by a beggar. Having no money to give him, he instead gave the beggar the ring on his finger. Several years later, in 1065, two English pilgrims found themselves assisted in the Holy Land by an old man, who revealed himself to be St John the Evangelist, and also the beggar that St Edward had given his ring to. St John gave them the ring, telling them to give it back to St Edward, with the message that he would meet him in heaven in 6 months, when he died. Now, the ring found in the coffin in 1102 is supposed to be that very ring, and the sapphire from it is alleged to be the sapphire that is now on top of the imperial state crown. Now, nothing whatsoever remains of the church that Edward the Confessor built and was buried in, nor of his first grave, or even of the shrine of 1163, for the whole of the eastern part of Westminster Abbey, including the chapel and shrine of St Edward, now date from the 13th century and from the reign of one of England's most remarkable kings, King Henry III. Henry III was the son of King John, and he was born in 1207. His reign began when he was only 9 years old in 1216, and he would go on to rule for another 56 years until 1272. Henry, like his predecessor Edward, was a pious man, and in the final years of the 1230s, at a time when he was struggling for dominance of his kingdom against his power-hungry barons, he developed a particular devotion to his saintly predecessor, and he adopted Edward the Confessor as his personal patron and the patron of his royal Plantagenet house. His devotion to St Edward was so marked that in 1239, when his eldest son was born, Henry III named him Edward after his saintly patron. In 1241, Henry III decided that he would construct a brand new and much grander shrine for St Edward in Westminster Abbey, and in 1245 he resolved to sweep away the whole of the Confessor's church and build an up-to-date new abbey church to contain it. The new Westminster Abbey, the present Westminster Abbey, was begun in the 1250s, and not only would it serve as a setting for St Edward's shrine, but it was intended from the very beginning to be a place for coronation and a new mausoleum for Henry III's dynasty. But more of that in the next video. English medieval kings were rarely flush with cash, and Henry had his fair share of troubles during his reign, and that diverted funds from the building campaign, and the construction of the new abbey church was therefore painfully slow. It took 17 years before the work was sufficiently advanced for the church to be consecrated. Finally, on the 13th of October 1269, the east end of the new abbey church was consecrated, and St Edward's relics were then translated from the earlier shrine to the new shrine. King Henry, with his brother Richard, the King of the Romans, bore the remains of the saint upon their shoulders, carrying it from the earlier shrine into the newly constructed chapel behind the high altar. Which brings me to why English kings have always changed from St Edward's crown to the state crown before leaving the abbey. Quite simply, the medieval St Edward's crown didn't belong to the kings who wore it. They simply borrowed it for the ceremony. For the crown was a sacred relic that was in the care of the abbey, the abbot and the Benedictine monks. It has been argued that the medieval St Edward's crown was the one that Edward was wearing when his coffin was opened in 1102, and that it was removed as a relic at the translation of St Edward to his new shrine in 1163. It makes an awful lot of sense, for the crown first makes an appearance in the reign of King Henry III, and the king was so enamoured with it that he had a second coronation with it in 1220, and every king until the crown's destruction in 1649 was crowned with it. When new regalia was made for the coronation of Charles II, a St Edward's crown was simply recreated. Now, you may have noticed that when Charles III was crowned with the modern St Edward's crown, it was the Dean of Westminster who brought it to the Archbishop. That's because the ancient St Edward's crown was kept in the abbey even up to 1649 in the keeping of the Dean, who was of course the successor in office to the medieval abbot of Westminster. When Charles III took the crown off and laid it on the altar before the shrine of the saint in his chapel, he was doing what all his predecessors had done back to King Henry III. He was giving the crown back into the care of the abbey to whom it belonged. The raised base of the present shrine of St Edward the Confessor at the centre of his chapel is the one that King Henry III commissioned in the 1260s, and it was onto this base that the remains of St Edward were placed, sealed into a golden casket of ferretry. The base of St Edward's shrine is made of Purbeck marble from Dorset, but Henry commissioned artists from Italy to decorate it. The shrine base is covered with beautiful micro-mosaic laid in geometric patterns known as Cosmati work, after the Roman family of that name that first developed this type of mosaic decoration. The Italian craftsmen were led by a man called Pietro de Odorizio, who on his return to Italy after the work was completed here at Westminster in the early 1270s would go on to be responsible for the tomb of Pope Clement IV at Viterbo. We know that Pietro was responsible for the shrine base because he incorporated an inscription into it, which sadly is no longer fully extant. As well as working on the shrine base, Pietro and his craftsmen were also engaged in producing a mosaic pavement for the floor of the chapel, which, although battered by time, is also still extant. And of course, they were also responsible for the great Cosmati pavement that is directly in front of the abbey's high altar, on which kings are crowned. The shrine of St Edward would remain a focus of pilgrimage and devotion until the English Reformation in the 1530s. One of the first phases of the English Reformation in the late 1530s was an attack on the cult and veneration of saints, with shrines across the country toppled and relics destroyed. It seems that the shrine of Edward the Confessor, in common with all others, was taken down, but perhaps in respect to his royal status, his remains were then reburied under the floor of the chapel. It appears that the various elements of the shrine were carefully dismantled and then stored away. The Benedictine Abbey community, which had protected the shrine, was dissolved and dispersed in 1540 during the dissolution of the monasteries, and Henry VIII converted Westminster Abbey into a cathedral, with William Benson, the last abbot, becoming the first Bishop of Westminster, and no doubt that helped protect the remains of St Edward. The Diocese of Westminster would last for only 10 years, and in 1550, in the reign of the much more fiercely Protestant King Edward VI, The abbey became a secondary cathedral within the Diocese of London. Then, in 1553, all change again. Mary Tudor came to the throne and Westminster Abbey was refounded and restored. And at this time, the remains of St Edward's Shrine were brought out of storage and reconstructed. And not very expertly, it has to be said. It was self-evidently a difficult jigsaw puzzle to put back together. A new ferretry box was not provided to replace the looted golden medieval ferretry, but St Edward's remains were, rather, placed inside a timber coffin that was then let down into the superstructure of the shrine base. On top of this was then placed the painted movable timber canopy that had once run up and down on pulleys and hidden and protected the gold ferretry, the medieval ferretry, from view. This has often been mistaken in the past as a new ferretry dating from Mary's reign, but it dates from around 1515 and is a very early example of the classical style. Edward the Confessor's remains are still within the shrine where they were placed at this time. This is a view from the top of the shrine with the canopy removed, which shows the wooden box that the relics are kept in. Now, the relics have not lain undisturbed since the restoration of the shrine in Queen Mary's reign. Over the years, the timber canopy on top of the shrine was damaged, and by the late 17th century, it was possible to peer through it and to see the coffin of St Edward within. During the coronation of King James II in 1685, the chapel of St Edward was scaffolded over to create a large gallery to accommodate some of the guests at the coronation. When it was being dismantled, it appears that the workmen were either careless or they intentionally broke through the lid of the Confessor's coffin, creating a hole in it that measured 6 inches by 4. One of the choirmen at the abbey at the time of James's coronation was a man called Henry Keep. He was a keen antiquarian and in 1682 had published a volume entitled Monumenta Westmonasteriensia, which was a historical account of his place of work. Now, he was a curious man, and in 1685 he couldn't resist having a peer into the hole that had been made in St Edward's coffin. He relates his discoveries in another work that he publishes in 1688, shortly before his death, which rather sensibly he writes under the pseudonym Charles Taylor. Keep tells us that after Matins on the 11th of June 1685, he went and fetched a ladder and he climbed up the side of the shrine. He presumably entered the space in the canopy through a missing panel, and then he reached his hand down through the hole into the Confessor's coffin. He relates how he turned the bones of the saint over and then, to his astonishment, withdrew from under St Edward's shoulder blades a remarkable object, a crucifix richly decorated and enamelled, attached to a 24-inch long gold chain. Now, at this moment, Keep tells us that he somewhat hesitates. He puts the cross and the chain back in the coffin and he climbs down the ladder again. His hesitation is because he feels he should immediately inform the Dean of the discovery. However, the Dean is away, and fearing that someone else might steal the object and it might then be lost, he returns 3 hours later with another choirman, goes up the ladder again, and removes the cross and chain and takes it back home to his lodgings. Now, the Dean of Westminster, who is also the Bishop of Rochester, is not in residence then for another month, and Keep stashes his find away under his bed in his lodgings. He eventually shows the object to the Dean in July, who then in turn advises it be shown to the Archbishop of Canterbury at Lambeth. And Sir William Dugdale, the venerable antiquary, even comes along to have a look at it. Keep added that when he went to the shrine for the second time on the 11th of June to remove the cross, he was rather bolder than he had initially been, and he tells us that he picked up the skull of St Edward and drew it towards the hole to see it, and he records that the skull was in really good condition, it was full of teeth, but that around the temple was what he describes a list of gold, about an inch deep, like a coronet, which is presumably a 12th century funerary crown. The Dean and Archbishop suggested that the crucifix and chain should be presented to the king, and Keep, who still had them in his possession, delivers them to James II at Whitehall in July. On receiving the object and hearing of the circumstances of the discovery, James II then paid for the repair of the Confessor's coffin, encasing the original coffin in a new outer box made of 2-inch thick planks bound in iron to prevent it ever being breached again, and that is what we can see here in this photograph. And it has not been disturbed since, and presumably the Confessor's remains still lie within. Sadly, the whereabouts of the cross and chain is now uncertain. It is believed that James II took them with him to exile at the time of the Glorious Revolution in 1688, but they don't appear among the goods belonging to him at the time of his death in 1702. It's a mystery, but he may well have given them away in his lifetime. There is a tradition that James II's son, the Old Pretender, gave them to Pope Benedict XIII in 1729, and if so, they have long vanished without trace. Keep tells us that he had an artist draw the cross and chain, but sadly that drawing cannot be traced either, and we have to rely therefore on his descriptive powers to give us an idea of what it looked like. The chain consisted of a series of oblong links joined at the top with a knob of gold, which Keep says was a sort of locket that was studded with a couple of rubies and had some dangling beads from it. The cross, which he says is a cross humeti fleury in heraldic language, a cross that terminates in fleurons, stylized flowers, had a depiction of the crucifixion on one side in enamel with an eye above it casting a ray on Christ, and then a figure of a Benedictine monk on the reverse. Keep says that the cross was hollow and that 2 little screws allowed it to be opened, so that it appears that it was originally a reliquary pendant. It must have been an extraordinary object. Whether it was an object that belonged to St Edward, or one that was a gift to the shrine, or even one added to his coffin at one of the translations of his relics, we will never know. The description doesn't really help determine the age of it. It has been suggested that it might well have been a Byzantine reliquary, and that the figure of the Benedictine monk is in fact a figure of St Zachary. In the next video, I will look in some detail at the tombs that surround the shrine of St Edward, for in the years after Henry III constructed the chapel and the whole east end of the Abbey church, the chapel became a mausoleum for the Plantagenet dynasty, and it is filled with some of the finest monuments to survive from medieval Europe. Thanks very much for watching. If you enjoy this channel, you're bound to enjoy my magazine, The Antiquary. Published every month, it is a labour of love for me, and in it I explore some of the more obscure aspects of our shared history, all beautifully illustrated in full colour. It ships across the world, is offered in print and digital format, and readers give it 5 stars on Google. If you love your history like me, particularly the history of objects, buildings, people and places, why not consider subscribing? Subscribing helps support my work and the channel too. There's a link above and in the video description that takes you to the magazine website.